it's Lee from colouringqueen.net, and today I thought we would have coffee, crime and colouring, and I'm colouring a picture called Ellie from Julia Speary's Etsy shop with my Lyra Giant pencils, so I don't know whether that was a wise decision or not. And yeah, I've finally gone and got a second opinion on my wrist. It wasn't, the left hand wrist actually wasn't sprained, it's actually tendon damage, so I've got to wear this black brace thing on it that you can see on screen for 6 weeks, and then they're going to decide whether I need cortisone injections or surgery, and yeah, we'll see how we go. It's not doing my medical anxiety any good having to go to the doctor, but we'll see how it goes, and I'll try and keep it out of screen as much as possible because it's really annoying. But my right wrist is so much better. And yeah, my doctor has banned me from basically typing, leading Buddy, because she thinks that pretty well leading Buddy is what damaged the tendons in the first place, because he does tend to pull a bit, and I'd bought a new lead that sort of uses both hands. So that seems to have been the reason for the tendon damage, which David has to get up early now and walk Buddy at like 4 o'clock in the morning because I'm not allowed to. And I've got to wear it 24 hours a day except for when I'm having a shower. So it's all a pain. But, you know, hopefully it'll heal up and I won't need the other things that they discussed. I hope not. I hope you guys are all doing well today. So last time we talked Coffee, Crime and Colouring, it was about Natasha Ryan, the girl in the wardrobe, and this time I thought we'd move up a bit and we'd talk about the man in the attic. And I have to wonder, would you know if someone was living in your attic? Not just for a few days, but for years? Not just in one house, but in others that you moved to? I'd like to think that I would know, but I don't make it a habit to check the attics in the houses that I've lived in. If I hear something, I always put it down to a possum crawling into the space and making himself at home, but never a human being. But in today's Coffee, Crime and Colouring, we're going to talk about a case that one newspaper compared to a fantasy that even fiction writers would not have dared to create, being so weird. So the story starts with a woman called Warburga Kerschel, and she was nicknamed Dolly, and that's what we'll call her because that name's a mouthful, and my German is lousy because I got kicked out of German as well as Spanish. So things were pretty tough for Dolly in her childhood. She grew up on a farm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and she had to go to work in a shoe factory when she was just 14 years old. And it was there that she met the boss's son, Fred Osterich, also German, and also my pronunciation is terrible. I am sorry in advance to all of my German friends. Danke, that's all I know. Who is 3 years older than her, and they began dating. They got married when Dolly was 17 and Fred was 20, and that was back in 1897. So the two continued to work together each day at the factory until business-minded Fred decided to open up his own shoe shop in Milwaukee. And he started other shoe stores, and then he turned to manufacturing, and he made caps and then aprons. I never really see aprons anymore, with his own company that he set up called Osterich Manufacturing Company. And everything Fred touched, it really was successful. He really had a great business acumen. And Dolly continued to work in the factory alongside her hubby, and she was said to be a really good counterbalance to Fred. He was a bit distant and some staff found him a little unlikable, but by now Fred's business had really taken off and he was working 12 hours a day, and Dolly would be the one that would sort of come into the factory and smooth things over with her charm to resolve any disputes that might happen at the factory. But sadly, tragedy would strike the couple when their only child Raymond became sick, and he died in 1910, just before his 10th birthday. And everyone deals with grief in a different way. Sometimes it brings couples closer together, and sometimes it doesn't. And in this case, the couple seem to have dealt with their grief in completely different ways. A friend of the couple claimed Dolly was completely unaffected by the death, but Fred was heartbroken. Outwardly, though, Fred doubled down on working and he spent longer at the factory. And when he'd come home, he'd be drinking pretty heavily. And Dolly, sort of starved of attention, would seek comfort elsewhere, if you know what I mean. And when Dolly was 33, her life would change forever, because that was the day that Dolly's sewing machine broke down. That sounds funny, doesn't it? Upset that the machine wasn't working, she demanded her husband send the repairman over to fix the machine, and he dutifully did. Now, Dolly was well aware of who the repairman would be because she'd met him many times at the factory when he was repairing machines for the company. And his name was Otto Sanjubar, and he was the teenager that had caught Dolly's eye. He was originally Otto Weir, but he'd been adopted by Mr. and Mrs. George Sanjubar, who were actually neighbours of the Ostericks in Milwaukee. And he was described as a retiring, quiet boy, barely 5 foot tall, thin, and with acne. So it was 17-year-old Otto that was sent to fix Dolly's machine, and he was greeted at the door by the side of Dolly in just stockings and a silk robe. So fixing the sewing machine was forgotten pretty quickly, and it was fun times instead. It was basically lust at first sight, and the two began an affair, meeting in hotels at first, and maybe that proved too difficult or expensive. Either way, they moved the relationship back to the marital home, and careful not to arouse the nosy neighbours, Dolly would pass Otto off as her never-do-well half-brother, which she didn't have, by the way. Fred had started to get a little bit sus, though, and he heard some rumours that Dolly may be stepping out on him, so he hired a private detective. And it didn't take long for the detective to uncover the relationship with Otto. Like many couples where one party's been unfaithful, Fred was willing to forgive and forget if Dolly broke it off with Otto. And Fred actually enlisted one of his friends to help him follow the couple, and later get the friend to speak to Dolly about it. And Dolly's attitude was that if he didn't like her, he could divorce her. But Dolly was no longer content with the sneaking around for afternoon delight, and she decided that she wanted to live with Otto. Now, most people would separate from their husbands first, but Dolly didn't want to do that. She wanted to have her cake, and Otto too. So Fred, no longer seeing Otto at the factory, assumed that Otto had taken the hint and left Milwaukee. But that's because Fred had no idea of Dolly's cunning plan. Dolly decided that the best thing would be for Otto is to quit his job and move into the attic. Fred was busy working 12 hours a day and often drunk, so it was unlikely he would ever go up there. But there was one condition. Otto couldn't leave the house, and he had to stay in the attic and away from the window. Now, you'd think that a young man wouldn't be willing to give up going out and seeing his friends and family and having a career, and wouldn't be willing to accept those sorts of conditions, but Otto did. He didn't have a family to speak of, and according to the LA Times, Dolly was like his mother, that he apparently slept with up to 8 times a day. So anyway, he agreed to move into the attic, just 25 feet away from the marital bedroom. And the attic was accessed by a sliding wall in the closet that led to a trunk room and then a door to the attic. And Otto had actually bought a lock so he could lock it from the inside. And Dolly kitted it out for him, single bed, desk, some buckets of water, and, made sure he avoided the window and the sunlight. And that's where Otto would spend the evenings reading by candlelight, the nautical library books that Dolly would borrow for him. And it sort of inspired something that he'd always thought of writing his own books. And so he wanted to write pulp fiction or penny dreadful stories, those 10-cent magazines popular at the time, where you escaped into a world of murder, sex and mystery, which is starting to mirror Otto's own life, in fact. And during the day, when Fred left for work, he'd come on down from the attic, he'd spend some time with Dolly. They would clean up the house together, sort of play house, cook dinner. He would even shine Fred's shoes. And sometimes they would make a bit of gin in the bathtub during those prohibition times. I don't know how, with the 8 times a day and all the cleaning, etc., that they found the time, but they did. So of an evening, when Fred and Dolly were out, Otto would emerge from the attic and he'd do his exercise, walking around the top of the house and occasionally standing on the landing to the stairs below. But he was always armed with 2 small pistols, because you never know, when a mouse is going to run down from the attic. So the arrangements seemed to be going super well, and soon Otto was having some of his stories published too. And he used a pen name for those, and he and Dolly would soon be celebrating 5 years in the attic together. Just Otto and Dolly and, of course, Fred. Fred was drinking more and more of an evening, and I'm laughing because it's just so bizarre, not for what happens next. And when Fred came home from work, which Dolly used to her advantage, so when he heard things that would go bump in the night or see shadows in front of his door, Dolly would just blame it on his boozing. And she even suggested that he see a doctor about these imaginings, which he did, but nothing came of it. One of the things that Fred did notice, though, was that food tended to disappear in the house, and his grocery bills were a lot more, especially when he was looking forward to that bit of roast beef and couldn't find it, and as usual Dolly would convince him that he'd imagined it. But even through all this excess drinking, Fred's business continued to thrive. He decided to open up another factory in LA in 1918, and the couple would move there. Now this wouldn't be the end of the Dolly and Otto relationship, though, because Dolly only agreed if she could choose the new house. The house she chose overlooked Sunset Boulevard, and of course it had that essential feature in every Californian home, not an attic. Now, there are a couple of different versions of how this unfolded. One is that the private detective told Fred that Otto was still on the scene, and the other is that Fred came home after a fight with Dolly at a party, and when he walked in, he discovered Otto in the kitchen eating his food. But he didn't actually recognise him, and he kicked him out. But Fred, in his own mind, had now solved the food shortage problem. Some stranger was coming in and stealing it. But he didn't recognise Otto because Otto had been living in the attic. He hadn't seen sun. He was extremely pale and very thin. Remember, he was only living on the leftovers and scraps from this home, and he'd been living in a cluttered up room with no real exercise or physical activity. So Otto, once kicked out, he had to spend a cold night outside waiting for Fred to leave for work. And then Dolly gave him the train fare and shipped him off to LA, where he worked as a janitor until the couple arrived in LA. And by the time they moved into their new home, Otto was already there, in the attic. But Otto, apparently at this time, he wanted to join the army and leave, but Dolly wouldn't hear a bar of it, and things continued on as usual. He was only 22 at that time. And things just went on as before, but in LA. And now Fred was a really heavy drinker, and he was often in a bad mood when he arrived home from work, and sometimes a tad argumentative with his wife, and the neighbours would complain that both of them would argue and raise their voices regularly to one another. On one of these occasions, on the evening of 22nd of August 1922, the couple had been guests at Mr. and Mrs. Coon's home, and they returned home just before 11 p.m, and it seems once more they got into it and were arguing. And their raised voices reached the attic and Otto, and he felt compelled to come on down and protect his woman. But he wasn't on his own. He had his 2 pistols with him, one in each hand. And when he burst in on the arguing couple, Fred, of course, recognised him from the days that he worked at the factory some years earlier, and Fred must have gone from confusion to conclusion as the two struggled. Now, Otto shot Fred 3 times, once in the temple, twice in the chest just above the heart, and the gun went off at one stage and hit the ceiling. Fred was dead. Knowing that the gunshots would be heard by the neighbours, the two needed to come up with a fast plan to protect Otto and ensure Dolly was not blamed for her husband's death. So they decided that they'd lock Dolly into a cupboard, taking the keys and pistols with him. And the story that Dolly was to tell the police was that while she was hanging her fur coat upstairs in the second floor closet, she was pushed from behind and locked in. And then that way Dolly could explain that they'd returned from the party, surprised a burglar who'd come in, shot Fred, locked her in the cupboard, and stole a few items, including Fred's diamond-studded watch. In fact, Otto had taken Fred's diamond watch off before running back to his attic, and the key for the closet was laying on the floor alongside 4 .25 caliber cartridges near Fred's body. The police arrived quickly, having been called by the neighbours as predicted, and hearing her screams from the closet, they broke down the door. And Dolly was frightened, and she had to be carried to her bed, where she collapsed. Dolly told police the story that they had cooked up, that she went upstairs to her bedroom, and while there she heard something that sounded like her husband slipping on the floor, and then there were shots, and she screamed, and before she could get downstairs to help her husband, the closet door was shut in her face and she was locked in. The police didn't really buy the story, but the evidence didn't support any other scenario. And Dolly couldn't resist embellishing it a bit and telling police that the couple never fought in all their years of marriage, which didn't make sense to Chief Klein, who was in charge of the case, as most couples bicker from time to time. Now, it seemed really odd to him that the thieves would take the watch, but not his wallet, which was found in his trouser pocket. The other odd thing was that the front door of their house faced Mrs. Norton over the road, and she'd ran to her door at the first shot and stayed there until the police arrived, and she didn't see anyone leave. The police had searched the house and couldn't find any sign of the burglar, so their assumption was that Dolly was the burglar. But there was no pistol, and they couldn't find an explanation for how she could lock herself in the cupboard. And sorry, Millie is really disturbing me. The other odd thing was that the police couldn't reconcile a burglar with such a dainty pistol. It seemed all wrong for the crime. So you would think now, with Fred out of the picture and Dolly a wealthy woman, the two lovers could be together openly. But no. Dolly promptly bought another home with an attic and installed Otto in it. And Otto seemed happy with this arrangement and took his small earnings from his magazine articles and a few bits and bobs that Dolly sometimes threw his way, and he bought a typewriter and set up for his writing career. And Dolly set up a post office box for him to receive his mail from publishing companies, and on occasion some cheques, and they even set up a joint bank account to deposit the cheques from his publishers, because Otto couldn't, leave the attic and go down to the bank. But it seems that the death of Fred just really created a job vacancy for Dolly, and she needed more than her Batcave lover. She needed another. So the first man to catch her eye was Ray Hedrick, and he was 4 years younger than Dolly. He worked at the local service station and he was married. But his wife Genevieve was not having a bar of this relationship, and she put her foot down, and Ray stopped seeing the Merry Widow. Dolly's next choice as best boy was lawyer Herman Shapiro, and he was actually the lawyer handling Fred's $1 million estate and Dolly. Of course, he knew nothing about Otto. So, as Dolly had a 3-bedroom home, she invited Herman to move into one of the bedrooms. And he seemed very willing to do whatever Dolly wanted. And during her relationship with Herman, she gifted him a beautiful diamond-studded watch. But Herman was a lot like Fred, meaning he spent a long time at work and travelling for work, leaving Dolly without the attention she craved. So clearly she needed another man to fill that void. Not content with Otto and Herman, she also started to get sticky with Roy Clum. And I have no idea what Otto thought of these relationships. But it seems to me that Dolly really ruled Otto and he went along with whatever she proposed. Now, Roy Clum was happy to dispose of the pistol that Dolly asked him to by throwing it in the tar pits, and she told him that she needed to get rid of it because it resembled the gun that was used by the burglar that awful night her husband was shot, and she just didn't want it around her. The second pistol that Otto had was disposed of by a neighbour who buried the gun in his garden for her. And it's clear that Dolly, although not glamorous in the usual way for that time, she certainly was attractive to people and had a way of getting people who would be happy to do things for her. Please train me, Dolly. Please tell me how it's done. I can't even get David to not put things on my sideboard. Anyway, her affairs just a short time after her husband's murder didn't really sit well with the community, and she was seen to be a bit of a sex-mad femme fatale, or a black widow. About a year after Fred's murder, Captain Herman Klein was still on the case, and he decided that he'd visit Herman Shapiro, because he was the estate's lawyer, at his office to run through the facts one more time. And on Herman's wrist, he noticed a diamond-studded wristwatch, just like the one that Dolly had reported stolen. Now, Herman readily admitted that Dolly had given him the watch. But Herman asked Dolly about the watch, and she said she found it after all. It was underneath a cushion, and she hadn't bothered the police about it, as it wasn't important. But the police thought it was important, and they questioned her about it. And she explained that she'd found it under the cushions. She was mistaken that her husband was wearing it that night, and she'd given it to Herman because she really admired him so much. What Dolly hadn't counted on, though, was that Roy Clum would turn on her when she broke things off, and he promptly went to the police with the story about disposing of the gun for her. The police went to the tar pits, they dug up the gun, and this was all reported in the papers. And after seeing it, the neighbour came forward with his story of burying the other gun in the garden underneath a rose bush. It was dug up, but both guns were really corroded. Dolly explained that she asked the guns to be disposed of because their presence in the home might be really embarrassing given the circumstances of Fred's death, and she tearfully told police that Fred was her only sweetheart and they'd worked together all their lives and she had nothing to do with his murder. Now, the explanation didn't cut it with the police, and although they couldn't prove that either gun was the murder weapon, they felt that they had enough evidence to arrest Dolly, which they did on 12th of July 1923 for the murder of her husband. Now, Herman, he decided he would give up all of his other clients and just work on defending her. What he didn't mention was that she'd promised him 50% of this estate, but, you know, whatever. And Herman was living in the house at that time, and he'd even had friends over, and never once or seen or heard of Otto until when Dolly was in custody for this murder. And she consulted with him as her lawyer and asked him, or leaned over and told him, you know, my brother's in the attic. You need to go and get him some food. And he couldn't believe it. And especially when Dolly said, look, you've got to go in and scratch on the closet ceiling, and that'll let him know it's okay to come out. And Sherman asked the trial lawyer, Frank Dominguez, what he should do, and Frank said, get him out of the house, you know. We don't want this never-to-do-well brother in the house, because, you know, that also might give another alternate of who could have done this. So he couldn't bring himself to scratch at the door like a mouse, but he whistled instead. And opened up the closet door and he found Otto through the sliding panel. Otto welcomed him into his little attic cave, and he noticed looking around that he had a reading lamp, canned goods, electric foot warmer, a safety razor. He even had Herman's old crystal radio set there, which he'd been wondering where it was. And the two actually sat down for a long chitty chat. And Otto was starved of conversation. After all, he'd only spoken to Dolly, during all of this time. And Herman told Otto he couldn't stay there. And the next day, Otto left the country, taking up residence in Canada as Walter Klein. Now, he chose the name because Captain Klein was in charge of the investigation, and he felt that he was his nemesis, so he sort of, made a play on it and made his name Walter Klein with a K rather than a C. I don't know. Dolly ended up being freed on $50,000 bail, and 6 months later she was released. The case fell apart. The police just could not prove how Dolly was in the closet. And the prosecutor said at that time, that locked door has us licked, and the case was dismissed. Now, Herman should have told the court about Otto, but he didn't, and he continued to act as Dolly's lawyer. From time to time, Otto would contact Dolly for money, and she would send it through via Herman. But there was a year or so in 1924 where she hadn't heard from him, and she grieved like he was dead because she couldn't understand why he hadn't contacted her. But in July 1925, she started getting calls from Mr. Honey again, and Mr. Honey was her little pet name for him. And he was asking for money, which Herman would send on. And a year later, Otto returned to LA, but this time he had a wife, Matilda. And he'd met her when he was really ill, no doubt in 1924 when he wasn't contacting Dolly, and she'd nursed him through that. They were now married, and they were now Mr. and Mrs. Walter Klein. But even though married, he said that returning to the area and being near Dolly made life worth living. Now, I bet you his wife just loved that. So he asked her for money again, and this time she refused. And I'm thinking Dolly didn't like the fact that Otto had remarried. And she told him that she didn't have any money and times were really tough for her. Now Otto, still under her spell, told her he would get a job to, get this, help Dolly out. Otto ended up actually getting 2 jobs, working one in a hospital and as janitor in the apartment building he and his wife lived in. Now, I don't know if he ever paid Dolly any money, but in fact, Dolly hired Otto to rebuild the wall to the attic and to fix up his back cave, and, well, he did. So by September of 1927, she was back on with Ray Hendrick, and he turned into a bit of a financial whiz and really successful like her late husband. And when compared to Herman, Ray was really a winner, and it caused a bit of stress in the relationship, and her and Herman started fighting. Ray's wife, though, Genevieve, she wasn't giving up without a fight, and she decided that she was going to sue Dolly for $300,000 for alienation of affections, because Dolly showered Bert with gifts and basically he was drowning in gin. And Genevieve's mother, she claimed that Dolly had threatened Genevieve's life if she didn't withdraw the claim. But Dolly just doubled down and she sued the mother for $500,000 for slander. Both of the claims that the women launched ended up being dismissed, and Bert ended up divorcing Genevieve. Lots of drama. But of course all good things have to come to an end, and Herman and Dolly finally broke up, and Herman was not happy. He stewed on all he knew, and just like Roy Clum before, he ended up writing it all out in a 15-page affidavit, which he sent off to the LA County DA's office in 1930. And in it, he set out all the details of when he first came across Otto in the attic, and the tale that he told him of meeting Dolly in 1911 and living in all the attics and all the homes and moving to LA. But more importantly, he told about the night that Fred died. Now, he did this as an affidavit rather than as a statement, because an affidavit is what you can be tested on in court. It's a court document rather than a statement. And so lying in your affidavit is perjury. And yeah, so he was really keen. The fact that he did it as an affidavit tells us that. So Otto had told Herman that he'd heard the noise, came downstairs in his PJs. Fred had yelled at him, "What are you doing here, you dirty rat?" And he'd replied the same thing as you. Fred lunged towards him to grab the gun he was holding. First bullet hit the ceiling, and then Fred nearly managed to shoot him, but Otto shot him instead. The DA ordered the arrest of both Otto and Dolly on the 7th of April, Otto for murder and Dolly for conspiracy to commit murder. And after 18 years of knowing Dolly, Otto broke down after hours of grilling by the police, and he confessed to killing Fred. By this time he was 35, and he said that Dolly had always been so kind to him, and he became attached and felt really grateful to her, and they had this bond which just never ended. Dolly was released straight away on bail quite quickly, and Otto sat in jail. And the police during this time, while Otto was in jail, they popped around to all the houses where Otto claimed he'd lived in the attic, and they actually found the little attic rooms. Now, Otto pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, and they were separately tried. Otto then repudiated his confession, saying that Herman had dictated it all to him, it wasn't true. But his lawyer actually believed that Otto was mentally ill, because Otto had actually come and seen him 18 months beforehand with a statement that he was being victimised mentally. And so they arranged for psychiatric assessment. There were 3 psychiatrists in total that looked at Otto, and they all found him to be sane. Now, it doesn't mean that he wasn't affected with mental illness during that time. It's just that right now, when the trial was on, they found him to be sane. So he went on trial in June 1930, and his lawyer claimed that he was a love slave with the mind of an 8-year-old who was under the spell of Dolly. And Otto's defence was that Dolly had basically enslaved him. He didn't know what he was doing. And when he'd met Dolly in his teens, he found himself with a peculiar attraction for her. He found her young and pretty, and stuck with this older, stodgy businessman who didn't pay enough attention to her. And jurors were actually taken around to have a look at the attics on a little attic tour, and Otto showed them how he lived there and how he spent all those years in the attics. Now, because they charged him with murder, the death penalty was on the table back in those days. But the jury decided that he wasn't guilty of murder, and they found him guilty of manslaughter. Now, fortunately for Otto at that time, manslaughter charges had to be brought within 3 years of the death of the person, and the statute of limitations had now well and truly passed. So Otto's attorney argued that he couldn't be convicted of manslaughter, therefore he couldn't be punished, and the DA didn't object, and the judge just ordered Otto's release. The media went crazy for the case, as the facts were so bizarre, and Otto became known as the Batman, due to his existence in the cave-like conditions. Dolly was charged with conspiracy and went to trial after Otto. She pled not guilty, but she did change her story about the unknown assailants, and she told the police the night of the murder she and Fred had argued, and she said that Otto had killed out of jealousy, not in fear of her life. But she claimed when they came home they were looking there for the cat, and while walking Fred grabbed her by the shoulder and told her she looked good tonight and gave her a kiss. But Otto was on the landing of the stairs doing one of his walkabouts around the house, and he yelled out stop and just shot him. There was a bit of a struggle, and Fred was shot again. The rest is pretty similar to the previous facts, but in this version, Dolly came up and told Otto that Fred was dead, and Otto said that he knew that, and he reminded her to stick to their story. Now, Dolly gave her evidence in tears and very tearfully, and she told the jury that she disposed of the guns because she wanted to protect Otto and because she knew that he really didn't mean to do it. The prosecution were hoping that Herman Shapiro would be their shining star witness, and he was subpoenaed to give evidence, and when he failed to appear in court, a warrant was issued for his arrest. He's given an affidavit, so you've got to give evidence to support what you've already said. But apparently he called the court and claimed that he couldn't leave St. Louis, where he was now living, unless his expenses were covered. All up, it doesn't seem to really matter because the jury of 6 men and 6 women were deadlocked at 9-3, and most in favour of Dolly's acquittal. So as it was a hung jury, she also walked free. Now, the prosecution didn't retry the matter, and the indictment was eventually dropped in 1936. So no one did any time for Fred's murder, and life just went on with a few court cases, and no one had to suffer really much at all except for when they were awaiting trial. So where did they all end up? Well, Ray Hendrick ended up getting into real estate, and he became Dolly's financial advisor, and also they rekindled their romance. He ended up accumulating millions and millions for Dolly, and all up they were together for 30 years, and they ended up marrying in March of 1961. By then Dolly was quite sick, and she was only married to Ray, or Bert as he's sometimes known, for 16 days before she died in April of 1961. No word if they lived in a house with an attic or a basement. No idea. Now, you might remember that those two had had an affair while Fred was still alive, after Fred's death, and while she was still with Otto, and Ray was married to Genevieve, so they really lasted a long time. Now, Dolly's lawyer, Jerry Geisler, he would go on to become pretty famous in his own right, defending Hollywood royalty like Charlie Chaplin, Errol Flynn, Bugsy Siegel, Robert Mitchum, and Marilyn Monroe. And in 1961, he said this case was still the most unbelievable case of his career. And what happened to Otto and his wife Matilda? Well, no one really knows, because they sort of rode off into the sunset, Mr. and Mrs. Walter Klein as they now were, and no one really knows much of what happened to Otto Walter afterwards. But I hope he was able to get on with his life, and I hope his wife forgave him. I hope he was able to get out of that sort of deep connection or codependency that he had on Dolly. It's just bizarre. But it seems like she moved on as well. She was able to get over her infatuation with him. I don't know, it's all just very bizarre. Now, if it sounds like a movie, that's because it is. It's a number of movies. There was one called The Bliss of Mrs. Blossom, one called The Man in the Attic, and one called The Lover in the Attic. I believe it's also on one of those like ID TV shows. I haven't watched any of those movies because I can't seem to get them here in Australia. So if you have watched them, I'd love to hear about them. And basically that's it from me. I hope you enjoyed this story today of the man in the attic, and I hope you're all not running around the house checking on it and seeing if anyone was there. I do think it is a crazy story. It's a pity poor old Fred never got any justice, but I don't know. It's just such a weird story. Weird. One more thing. One of the houses that they lived in was actually turned into apartments, and the attic was one of the apartments. But anyway, that's it from me. Until next time, stay safe and happy colouring.